There's this really strange thing that happens when lawyers communicate with people. And it goes something like this. When they're at a party or just chatting with their friends, they are perfectly human and normal. When they're sending messages to each other or Facebooking or whatever, they use a slightly modern but still fairly casual form of communication. And then when the time comes for them to write a letter of advice or communicate with a client, they turn into this strange, robotic, professional-sounding thing that, in my view, alienates them from humanity, at least to some extent. Why is that? Why is that? That is what we're going to talk about today. If you're new here, my name is Chris Hargraves. I'm from tipsforlawyers.com, and this is my podcast where I explore things that I hope will be largely relevant to lawyers in particular. If you enjoy the podcast, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe and leave a review, ideally a good review. I do appreciate that. You can do that at iTunes in particular, where you can get to by going to tipsforlawyers.com/iTunes. That will take you to the right place. Now, why is it that lawyers try to sound professional? That's the question of the day. When you email your mum and you say, "Hi mum, how's it going? Just thought I'd check in," you're pretty normal sounding, aren't you? But then when you email a client for essentially the same thing, do you say, "Dear Mr. Bloggs, I refer to our earlier email dated a week ago. Could you please advise whether you've had an opportunity to consider the content of that email and when you intend to revert to us on the matters we raised? Full stop, yours faithfully, lawyery sounding person." Why is this? Why is this? Personally, here's what I think happens. We have two slightly separated personas inside us, and the feeling we have is that when we're in lawyer mode or lawyer persona, it is our job to sound lawyery. The question is whether sounding lawyery is actually a virtue. Is it a good thing? Or is sounding lawyery just some crazy piece of nonsense that we've picked up along the way because we've created this fictitious story in our heads about what lawyers are supposed to sound like? Now, my personal view is that it's a little bit of both. There is certainly some virtue in sounding like a lawyer in certain circumstances. Some clients, not all, but some, get a certain degree of comfort from their lawyer being a little bit lawyery. Ideally, those clients have a tendency to get that comfort when you are lawyery with other people or on their behalf, but not necessarily with them. So when you go to court, for example, and there are certain formalities followed and certain types of language used, that is a very unique circumstance. And going to court does not necessarily fall within the normal realms of communication that it should. If you communicate to your client in the same way you communicate to the court, you're going to find that you seem a little aloof and that much of what you say doesn't make any sense. However, once again, when you're communicating with another lawyer, you might use slightly more lawyery language. You might not, though. And the question is it really necessary? And my personal view is that it isn't. Certainly there is some jargon that is pretty hard to avoid when it comes to drafting court pleadings and when it comes to doing certain aspects of the job. But if you are emailing a client just to say, "Hey, Bruce, did you have a chance to check out the contents of our email? ? Look forward to hearing from you." Why can't you write that instead of what I said before? Why can't you be as personable in an email as you are when you call them? And if you're really struggling with this, if you just go into default lawyery mode, I really want to suggest that instead of emailing people all the time, you just pick up the phone and actually call them. There are a number of reasons for this. The main one is it establishes your humanity. The second is it builds trust better. And the third is it gives you a much greater opportunity to gauge the tone of the response than an email will. Now, I know we like sending emails, and in some circumstances that might be the best way to do it, but it's not the best way to do it in all circumstances. And if you are looking to establish a relationship with a client, or you are looking to serve a client particularly well, then telephone calls are the way to go. Or face-to-face meetings, but those are expensive and those have a tendency to be inconvenient for your client, who is, at the end of the day, the person you want to look after. So, trying to sound professional in communications with your client in particular, I think you need to be very careful about it. And I think you need to be very careful about why you're doing it. Because what I suspect for the vast majority of young lawyers out there is that they think that lawyers communicate in a particular way, and that when they're in lawyer mode, that is simply how they communicate. My guess is that they don't give it much thought at all. That they don't actually sit down to think, oh, hang on, could I have just said this sounding like a human being rather than like a lawyer? And if they did that, they would find that their clients would respond much more appropriately, that they would put their clients at ease, in particular if you're not dealing with sophisticated clients. If you're dealing with clients who have perhaps, for example, a lower degree of education, they might have left before they finished high school or something like that, do you think they're really going to be impressed by lawyery sounding people? Or, and this is my contention, do you think that what's going to happen is you're going to distance yourselves from them? And that's going to have a number of problems associated with it. Firstly, if they have questions, they're going to be afraid to ask them. If they actually don't understand what you said, they're going to be afraid to ask them because they don't want to look silly. And do not underestimate the amount of pride that people have. The number of times that I've seen a lawyer's advice go out to someone, and then upon speaking with them, it became clear they had no clue what the advice actually said. You would be staggered how often that happens. But beyond simply ensuring that your client understands you, it allows for a closer connection between you and your client. And if you are seeking to establish relationships that are built upon trust, then that trust needs to come with a certain degree of humanity and vulnerability to it. And that vulnerability involves you communicating like a human being rather than like what you perceive a lawyer ought to communicate like. So I really want you, whoever you are, if you are involved in communicating with clients, to consider two things. Firstly, when you send an email to a client, would you send an email of that nature to a friend of yours? Now, I'm not talking about the content, I'm talking about the tone. Second, if you wouldn't, why? Was it necessary for you to establish some form of tone in order to communicate the way you did? Or was it not? And of course, if you're struggling in this area and you literally just default to formalities every time, then perhaps picking up the phone might help shake you out of that habit, and you might get in the habit of emailing in the same way that you speak, which I suspect, because I've seen it a lot, is going to be a lot more personable and approachable, and you might find that many clients respond to it a lot better. So stop trying to sound professional, stop trying to sound like a lawyer, or at least like you think a lawyer should sound like. I have the great benefit in this podcast of occasionally being able to sound like a lawyer because it's largely directed to lawyers. And so I can use words like contention, and I can use occasional words that I wouldn't necessarily use with someone else. So your communications need to be contextual, not just one size fits all. But that's a topic for another day. I'm going to sign off here. If you enjoyed this episode, if you got something out of it, let me know. Leave a comment, leave a review, tipsforlawyers.com/iTunes. Do not forget to say hello. I always appreciate it. And I shall see you in the next episode.